Hello and welcome to the very first episode of PowerPointers with Dan Weaver. I'm your host, Dan Weaver, and today we are going to be talking about making selections. Now, I know this isn't the most exciting topic for a first episode, but I promise we will be getting into more exciting stuff, assuming PowerPoint can even be exciting in our next episode. But before we can really get into the more interesting stuff, it's critical that we have a base understanding of how selections work in PowerPoint, being that you'll have a harder time with the more advanced stuff if you don't first understand selections. And I think you're actually going to find a few useful tips in this episode, so let's get started. So there are 5 selection topics I'm going to be covering in this episode, and here they are. So let's dive in with number 1, using grouping. Grouping is a simple concept, but an important one, and it's something that's used in many different tools and applications. In PowerPoint, like in many other tools, it helps us manage, move, size, and align multiple objects at once. I'll talk about managing groups in the next slide, so let's look at the other things grouping helps with first. As you can see, we have multiple objects on the screen, and each moves independently. I can select all these objects by clicking and dragging my mouse across all of them, and then once they are selected, clicking and dragging again to move them. However, if I want to move that same set of objects again, I have to reselect them again, and in the process of reselecting, I may miss an object or two. This becomes more troublesome when you have a multitude of layered graphics you are trying to move around. To make this easier, once we have the object selected, we can simply go to the Format tab, and from the Arrange section, click Group, and then click Group again from the drop-down menu. Now, if we click on any of the objects within that group, the entire group is selected, which makes it easier to move, resize, and format all the objects at the same time. When you resize something in a group, it resizes the group proportionately, as opposed to when you resize a set of independent objects all selected together. Side note, holding the Shift key on your keyboard and then resizing an object or a group keeps the aspect ratio, or the relation between the width and the height, the same. Even if I try to make the objects scale out of their ratio, with the Shift key they stay locked into place. Whereas if I don't hold Shift, they're still proportionately resized as a group, but the aspect ratio can become askew. Now, if I want to move an object within the group, I simply click on that object after the group is selected. This is visually indicated by the group's bounding box changing from a solid line to a dotted line, and the object I've selected within the group now showing its individual bounding box, which is what you'd call that box, this box with the white circular handles that appears around our object, allowing you to rotate and resize the object. Now, if I no longer want these objects to be in a group, I can simply ungroup them by selecting the group or an object within that group, opening the Format tab, clicking Group, and then clicking Ungroup. After I move these objects around, make my changes, and maybe even add some new objects, I can easily regroup the objects that were previously grouped by simply selecting an object from the original group, opening the Format tab, clicking Group, and then clicking Regroup. As you can see, the original objects are now all grouped back together, and a new object is not. On a side note, I can also access these grouping options by right-clicking on an object, or if you're using a Mac, by holding the Control key on your keyboard and then clicking on an object. Now, let's say you have multiple groups of objects that you want to be able to manage as independent groups as well as a master group. You can make as many subgroupings as you need. This allows me to manage all these items as a whole, as well as ungroup them back into smaller subsets. Now let's talk a little more about managing groups as well as other objects in our next topic, using the selection pane. As you can see, there are a lot more objects on this slide. Some of them grouped, some of them not, and it can be hard to manage. That's where the selection pane comes in. To access the selection pane, simply open the Home tab, then from the Editing section, click the Select drop-down and click Selection pane. The selection pane will then appear on the right. From here, I can find specific objects and select them. I can select multiple objects by holding the Control key on my keyboard as I select, assuming those objects aren't in a group or if they are within the same group. I can also see my groups here, as I just mentioned. I can collapse or expand them, and I can rename them to make them easier to identify by double-clicking on them. I can do the same with individual objects as well. I can change the order of objects by dragging them somewhere else, or using these arrow keys to move them up or down one level at a time. As you can see, when you change the order of an object, it determines if it is in front of or behind other objects on the screen. If there are objects that are obstructed by other objects, you'll be able to select them here. Without the selection pane, I would not be able to select and move this star shape without first moving all the other objects out of its way. But now I can easily move it by selecting it in the selection pane and then clicking on its bounding box and dragging it. Note that if I don't click on the bounding box, I'll accidentally reselect the group in front of it. If it's easier, I can even temporarily hide certain objects by clicking the eye icon next to them. That way, they aren't visible and can't be edited or accidentally selected as I move the other objects. So that's the selection pane, which is very useful when your slide gets as crowded as this one. So now let's talk about how an object's fill can affect how it's selected. You'll notice I have two objects, this one filled with the color blue, and this one, as you can see by the shadow, that is not filled in at all. When I select the filled in object, I can select it by its fill and by its border. But with the empty object, I can only move it by selecting its border. Otherwise, it would be like trying to pick up an empty picture frame by grabbing the empty space inside. This can be frustrating if the object doesn't have a shadow and might look just like a white box. You'll begin to wonder why you can't select it. Once you have selected the object, you can change its fill by clicking the Format tab. Then from the Shape Styles section, clicking the Shape Fill and changing it from no fill to a fill color. This will make it more easy to select. But there may be cases when you want just the border and you don't want it to be so easily selected, such as if I want a border on this part of the slide but want to be able to drag to make selections within it. If I have it filled, the object will get selected when I don't want it to. If I remove the fill, I can drag to make selections without moving the border. Or you could just hide it using the selection pane until you're done working on the slide. The last caveat to how fill affects selection is this. I can have a shape that looks like it's only a border if I give it a fill and then right click on it, choose Format Shape, and set the fill to 100% transparency. I'm still able to select the object by the fill even though I can't see it. Okay, moving on to discuss how text affects selection. As before, I have two objects. This time one has text and the other does not. The one with text can be selected just as the other one can. The only difference is that if I click where the text is, my cursor will change to the I-beam pointer or I-cursor. So clicking and dragging will not select the object, but rather will highlight the text. And if I select either of these objects and hit a letter on my keyboard, text will be added. Lastly, let's talk about the Shift and Control buttons on your keyboard and how they can be used to help make selections. When selecting multiple objects on your slide, you can click and drag, or if you want to select objects more specifically, hold down the Shift key on your keyboard and then click on the objects. Click them once to select them and again to unselect them. You can do the same thing by holding down the Control key on your keyboard. The only difference is that if an object is linked, such as how this object is linked to the previous slide, holding Control will cause the link to be activated when clicking on it, which is indicated by the cursor changing from a pointer to a hand. The other very helpful thing you can do with Control and Shift in terms of selections is make copies of objects and move objects on the horizontal or vertical axis. If I select an object and then hold Control on my keyboard while I drag, a copy of that object will be made. Once I unclick the mouse, the copy will be solidified. However, if I let go of the Control key while I'm still dragging it, the copy will disappear and I will simply be moving the original object. If I want to move an object along an axis, I simply hold Shift as I drag the object. Whichever direction I start moving in first is the axis it will stick to. So move horizontally and it locks in horizontally. Move vertically and it locks in vertically. There are some exceptions to this, such as in this case, if the object was aligned on an axis with other objects, crossing that axis will allow you to change to it. So I can switch from dragging horizontally to dragging vertically. To combine these two concepts, I can hold Control and Shift at the same time and it will create copies across an axis. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining me on the very first episode of PowerPointers. I've been your host, Dan Weaver, and I hope you found this helpful. I'll see you next time.